All right, so this particular presentation is going to be focusing on the early modern period, and this is the third and final um, period that we're going to be looking at in our World Literature 1 course. Let's go ahead and get started. When we talk about the early modern period, another name for the early modern period is what we call the Renaissance period. And if you know anything about the word Renaissance, it's defined as a rebirth of learning or a rebirth of creativity. A more technical definition of the Renaissance would be an economic, political, and social and cultural movement. And when we talk about this whole idea of rebirth, we see the connection, or you should see the connection to the Middle Ages or the medieval era, where we were able to see the rise of the church and its dominance over all parts of life. And as we get to the Renaissance period or the early modern period, we start to see that power and influence start to wane quite a bit. Now, there are still some influences, religious influences of the church that we still see in the Renaissance or early modern period, but it's not as defining as it was before. All right. And so when we look at the early modern period or the Renaissance period, however you want to look at it, we see that there are some things that were pretty much maintained from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance period. And that one of those things was this whole idea of Latin. Um, we talked about Latin being the primary language of the educated, the primary language of the nobility, the primary language of the clergy, and it continued to be that way. But then there were some things that changed. Individuals began to explore the human experience, both right here in the present and the human experience in the future. And then there was a new emphasis on individual achievement. And so there was a lot of celebration of people with individuals that had more than one talent or they had experiences in various fields. Um, there was a renewed spirit of adventure and discovery, and people started looking at the universe in a new and different way. All right, so here in the early modern period, we're going to look at it briefly from a few vantage points. We're going to look at it from economic, the educational, the social, the cultural, and the political, since these are all part of the movements that made up the early modern period. When we look at the economic portion, we're dealing with exploration, trade, business, and money. And so at the time, um, individuals up into the early modern period, individuals basically traveled, a majority of travel was by land. And so now, as we start shifting, there's a lot of movement towards travel by ship. And so navigation that involves navigation. And so there were a lot of improvements in the navigational tools, the magnetic compass, the astrolabe, or improvements to maps, and also shipbuilding improvements. And this is where we see the introduction of what they call the galleon. Prior to the Renaissance period or the early modern era, um, the ships were powered by manpower. So you would see oars coming out from the bottom of the ship, and there would be slaves down there driving moving the ship in the direction they needed to go. But the galleon was an improvement because it harnessed the power of the wind. So instead of relying on manpower, it used large sails and relied on the wind. And so instead of men being on the bottom of the ship, powering the ship or moving the ship, they were using the wind. And so as a result of these improvements in navigation began to be a more popular option than traveling by land because the road systems were not great, and there were chances that people traveling by land, moving uh, supplies and moving products by land could get robbed and that kind of thing. So it was better and safer for them to travel by sea than by land. And so in the early modern period. They said there was a spirit, a renewed spirit of adventure and discovery, exploration. And so here we have a lot of these explorers, and we have here some on the screen, Columbus, and that's a controversial, in the 21st century, 20th to 21st century, Columbus is a very controversial subject. Um, it is believed by many historians. It's always been taught that Columbus discovered America, but many historians have discovered and that Columbus never really stepped foot in North America. That he rather discovered some islands in the Caribbean, and that the person that really discovered America was an individual by the name of Amerigo Vespucci. John Cabot, he explored North America, specifically Canada. You had Francisco Coronado. He was key into exploring what we in the far west we consider to be New Mexico. Vasco Balboa was the first person to cross the Isthmus of the Panama. Ponce de Leon, pretty well-known name for in Florida. He explored Florida. Vasco da Gama, he was an individual who explored from Europe all the way to India. Ferdinand Magellan explored the Philippines, and he was the first to circumnavigate the entire globe. And it's believed that here we are talking about the connection between the medieval era and the early modern period. Many people believe in the flat Earth, that the Earth was flat, and as you get to the edge, you would fall off. And so, as they were traveling towards the horizon, because nobody had ever traveled around the globe before, the expectation was that because the Earth was flat, that they would fall off. And so his men almost mutinied and got rid of him because of their fear. But he was able to sail around the world and is most known for that. We had Sir Walter Raleigh, who explores the Virginia area. You had Tanaka Shasuke, who was actually from Japan, and he was known to have explored Mexico. And then here, for those of us that are Alabama natives, Hernando de Soto was a Spanish explorer known for exploring Alabama. Hence, the De Soto Caverns were named after him. And then Antonio Tavares was one that explored the Amazon River. And in all of this exploration, one of the things that drove exploration was not supply and demand, but more so imports, exports. And so here you had um, spices that were not native to Europe, like peppercorn, nutmeg, and cinnamon. And then you had silk and gold, silver, ivory, corn, tomatoes, chocolate, and unfortunately slaves. These things weren't native to Europe. And so they had to go out. When they went out and explored these various places, they found all these different items that became popular. And so there was a move to import these things more frequently. And as it relates to business and money, we see that capitalism has a big part to play in the Renaissance period. We had the shipping, which led to more opportunities to explore and to colonize these new lands. And that led to the institution of banking. Merchants and individuals that were involved in those kind of businesses needed places to handle the money that they were bringing in. And then this also introduces the whole idea of bookkeeping, keeping up with the amount of the money that you're making. And so during the early modern period, gold coins, silver coins, they were used for money. And then you had this coin called a billion, and it was more so a mixture of copper and silver. So we see the beginnings of currency or improved currency during this period. All right, let's move on to educational thinking and learning. All right. Um, we said again, Latin was the primary language of the nobility, the clergy, and the educated. And so the majority of books were written in Latin. And the book making process during this time was very, very difficult or strenuous. Books were not created on a copy machine or some kind of press. Books were copied by hand. So if somebody wanted a copy of a book, they had to get it done by hand, and that took a long time. And not only that, the ink that was used to copy these books were or had to be mixed by hand. And then the books had to be handmade and sewn together from animal hides and that kind of thing. And also at that time, there weren't any copyright laws, so people could take what they wanted in terms of from other people's works. And then it was interesting enough, the church became the center of the book business. Now, not only were they the center of education and learning and the development of the university, but now they're the center of the book business. Johann Gutenberg was one that revolutionized the book printing process and industry. In 1450, he invented the printing press, which revolutionized everything, made books less expensive, so that people who were not nobility now they could afford books. And then, most famously, in 1455, he printed the Gutenberg Bible. He made about 180 copies of it. And so now, people were wanting access to information. And so there was a renewed interest in classical learning, especially as related to Roman culture and Rome. And they started to emphasize a classical humanistic curriculum, and that which has its influence on today, grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, moral philosophy, and languages, specifically Latin and Greek. And so when people had access to information, they were able to come to conclusions by themselves. And so here we have an example of the geocentric view of the universe versus the heliocentric view of the universe. And so in the Middle Ages, the geocentric view of the universe was promoted. And that is that the Earth, Earth, was at the center of the universe and everything, including the sun, revolved around it. But then individuals, through their discovery, they found that the sun, it was actually the universe was actually heliocentric, sun, and that the sun was at the center and all of the planets revolved around it. And later on, they're gonna learn about and this is even going to change when they start discovering the laws of planetary motion, that the planets revolve not in perfect circles around each other, but actually ovals. Because in all honesty, if they revolved the way they're shown here, they would have all crashed into each other centuries ago. All right. There's an introduction to this whole idea of humanism. Everybody wants to, what is humanism? It's just, again, it's just an emphasis on individuals, and the kind of education that would apply to that idea. Grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, moral philosophy, again, Latin and Greek. What we see here is when we talk about religion in the early modern period, we're talking about the next step the individuals took. Once they were able to get books in their own, that books were much cheaper, the cost of education lowered. People were demanding books in their own languages so that they could read, specifically the Bible. They wanted to read books for themselves in their own native tongues. And then they read the Bible and they had the Bible. And then they started to kind of rethink. We call it rebirth of learning, the rediscovery. And so now you start seeing people starting to, because they have access to information, to start thinking for themselves. And so a individual, the clergyman in the Roman church at the time, named Martin Luther, he wrote up what they call the 95 Theses, or 95 ideas or main ideas. And he is most famously known for writing them and then nailing them to the door of the church. And some people would say, "Oh, that was so disrespectful." He just went up there and just desecrated the. But in actuality, the front doors of churches during that period were seen as community bulletin boards. So he went and he put his 95 Theses, where he talked about different things as he started to study more, the scriptures more, that he didn't, start to question some of the beliefs that were being taught, such as selling indulgences, having a mass or church service in Latin instead of the native tongues of the people, so they would be able to understand what was going on. devotion to Virgin Mary, mandatory celibacy of clergy, praying to deceased saints, and that the Pope himself had ultimate authority. He was also one to translate the Bible to German and to push the idea that the Bible was the only real source of divine knowledge. And so this Protestant Reformation, and I wish that my um, graphic here was a little bit more clear. What we start seeing here is how the church eventually breaks off into the what we say the Protestant wing, the Protestant, the Reformation. I think if in the beginning the individuals wanted to reform Protestant Reformation, it was protest reform. They wanted to reform the church from the inside, but what happens, they ended up creating a whole new sect of churches. And you can see here from the years how they've broken up. And you can go online and find a new, clearer map of churches, and you'll see the birth of all of the major denominations: Church of Christ, the Reformed churches, the Baptist, Anabaptist movement. You'll see every major denomination you can see on here. You can also go online and find a clearer map of that. And here is, if you want to, here's another version of that. We started out the Universal Church, then the Roman Church, and that breaks up into the Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, the Anglican Church, which became Protestant. That was probably the first Protestant church. And then the Reformed churches, the Anabaptists, the Presbyterians. The Church of England, you see here, it breaks up into out of the Church of England, you have the Baptists, the Congregationalists, which include the Quakers, the United Church of Christ, and you had the four that broke out of the Anglican Church, the Congregationalist Church, the Baptist Church, which out of the Baptists, you had the Southern Baptist Convention, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Then you have the Episcopalian, and that's basically the Church of England in the United States. Then you have the Methodist Church, and out of the Methodist Church came um, Salvation Army, Holiness Churches, and the AME Church. And they split off because of racial situation. And the AME Church, and then out of the Holiness, you had the Church of God, and then Church of God, Assemblies of God, Church of the Nazarene, Church of Christ. You see all the various, and then out of the Reformed or the Anabaptists, and you have like the Mennonites and the Amish, um, and the Presbyterians. Politically, um, monarchs began to challenge the church. Remember, the church. There was no, um, there was no, uh, there was no entity to basically check the church at the time. So the church pretty much was the supreme power in not only Europe, but the entire world for that point. But when we get to the early modern period, individuals, because of their views are starting to change, they began to challenge the church as the supreme power in Europe. And then the church began to be viewed as a foreign leader. All right. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. All other activities will be posted on Blackboard.